your day. It's a little earlier out here in the Northwest. I live just north of Seattle and have had a good day, got out for a long bike ride. And so I got some fresh air. Our air is clean after a lot of days of smoke from the fires out here. So again, thank you for joining. Just a little more background on me and a point of connection. I actually lived along the Hudson River as a boy. We lived in Dobbs Ferry, and I remember well, we lived literally almost on the bank of the river, and I remember the foghorns in the ships at night and playing down on the water's edge, trying to stay away from the trains, and have just great memories of going upstate New York, where my uncle was a professor at the University of Syracuse. And that's where my love for the Erie Canal and, of course, Low Bridge, Everybody Down. We could probably all sing a chorus or two of that song that we learned in school. So without further ado, I'm a retired professor, retired pastor. I don't like the word retired. I like third act. I'm in my third act. And now this paddle pilgrim thing has really taken off, where I've had adventures paddling the entire Mississippi River, 2,350 miles, the Erie Canal, Hudson River to the Statue of Liberty, most recently the Fjords of Norway, where my ancestors came from. And were it not for the coronavirus, I would have, with a couple of friends, paddled a long stretch of the Mekong River through Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And that's on hold, so that's the next adventure. And as I paddle, I ponder, and my pondering leads to writing and a bunch of books. And so if you're interested, you can get those books on Amazon, and you can get more information on my adventures, including some films I've shot, on my website. So let's head down the Erie Canal and Hudson River to the Statue of Liberty. As you well know, but often when I do presentations, folks don't really know where the Erie Canal and the Hudson River are. And for our purposes, that's a very simple map. And as you are well aware, probably 363 miles on the Erie Canal. I launched near Tonawanda. Then you hit the Hudson at Troy, and about 150 miles down the Hudson River to the Statue of Liberty. I took about 3 weeks to paddle that adventure, and the time of year literally was right now. I waited until it was a little cooler, and the fall colors were coming up. So this reminds me of my time on the canal and the river. That was the craft that I paddled. That is a wilderness experience tsunami, 17.5 feet long, perhaps a little big for some waters, but I've taken that down the Mississippi, and I've taken it out in the ocean here in the Northwest, and it took me very safely. I actually shipped it to Buffalo, and an outfitter brought it to the airport and picked me up and launched me, and I actually gave it to a camp at the end. I know one of my students, former students, directs a camp in New Jersey, and after I donated my kayak to the camp. So that's my sturdy craft. This is the first day on the canal, and I include a quote from my favorite poet, Mary Oliver. It really captures my philosophy of life, and she says, "Instructions for living a life: pay attention, be astonished, and tell about it." That kind of captures my life, and my mother, who was an English teacher, would be very happy to know that poetry continues to be a love of mine. Launching near Tonawanda, one of the challenges, as you all know, the hardest thing in kayaking is getting in and getting out of the boat. And they had a wonderful launching dock there. And that's one of the challenges along the canal, because most of the canal, the docks are too high. They're designed for larger craft, whether they be sailboats or cruisers. But I'm working with the canal, and I can talk more about this if you're interested later. A lot of the communities are installing more kayak-friendly docks. This is a little video I shot. As I was paddling along the first day, I found that the wall was weeping.
So, Dave, I don't know if it's happening to everyone, but for me, there's about a 15, 20-second delay between when it's apparent from your commentary that you've changed the screen and it changing on my computer. So it just changed for me to that video.
Okay, should I play it again?
So you're sort of aware that
it played right in.
No, I think it's good. Me, just start. Yeah, it's playing now for me, as we found out when we tested out, just as a sort of series of stills.
Okay.
But just so you're aware that people may not see what you're talking about until 10 or 15 seconds after you have changed your screen.
Okay. Okay. Sorry about that in transmission, but the wall of the canal was leaking and weeping, or maybe it was celebrating, baptizing me as I began my journey. But it was a wonderful distraction. I'm easily distracted, and I had to remind myself to keep going. And so I did. And as, again, many of you are no doubt aware, there are many locks and dams along, particularly the Erie Canal. And there are 35 locks on the Erie Canal. And for the most part, since it was late in the season, I was the only craft in the canal, and always treated very well by the lock masters. And that was always a highlight of my day, chatting with these great people that keep the traffic moving along the Erie Canal. Again, the weather was spectacular. You can see the color in some of the sumac along the canal beginning to come up. This is the third iteration of the canal. Of course, the canal was built between 1817, 18, and 1825. And it was a very narrow passageway, and I have some pictures later of that. But it's been enlarged twice, and it's really more like, if you haven't paddled it, like a small river, and generally speaking, fairly protected. Although it always seems, and you know this since you're paddlers, it always seems like headwinds are an issue you face. And there were several days when I hit some pretty significant headwinds. This was a gal who was fishing along the canal the first day. I like to call the people along the canals and the rivers and the fjords my canal angels. And so this was Jessica, and she was fishing. So I sat and chatted with her for a few moments. She was from the Department of Natural Resources, and she was fishing. And I found a particularly noble effort. She was catching fish for a merganser that had been injured, that she was nursing back to health. And so she was catching fish to feed her bird so that it could return to the wild. And we had a nice chat. As I got close to Brockport and Palmyra and Medina, and particularly Medina, I ran into a wonderful fellow. He was actually walking along the canal. His name was John Slack. And he had seen a picture of me that had been in the Buffalo paper the day before and shouted out to me, "I know who you are." So we had a nice chat. And he says, "Do you like beer?" And of course, that's a very easy question to answer. He said, "Well, just down the canal in Medina, my hometown, we're celebrating ale in autumn." And he said, "I'd be glad to host you." And so I finished my day's paddle, pulled in, set up my tent, and John and I walked the length of Main Street and enjoyed a lot of good ales and various stouts. And actually, when I went back and did a book tour a couple of years later, a year later, I guess it was, I stayed with John and Val. And, you know, that's one of the highlights for me of my pilgrimages is the people I meet along the way and the friendships that are made. Another one of those canal angels, this was Roberto. The towpath, of course, along the canal probably has more bicycle folks traveling back and forth than there are paddlers, although the number of paddlers is increasing. Roberto, who actually was from South America, but who had recently moved to the East Coast, had actually gone all the way from Buffalo to Albany and back. And so he was almost having completed his 720-mile bicycle ride. And so we sat down, this was in Brockport, and this is the edge of the Brockport Visitor Center, which is a very nice visitor center with showers and a computer room and lots of good maps. He gave me all sorts of tips on the best places to stay, to camp, and also places to avoid. This is his bike over there. So Roberto, another canal angel. The packet boats, which you can rent actually quite reasonably. This was a group of Michiganders who I played leapfrog with along the canal. I would get ahead of them, and then I would camp, and then they'd go ahead of me, and they were in no hurry. And so we chatted many, many times. And as you can see, their bikes are on top. So if you don't feel like paddling, or if you know of friends who would like to go on the canal, these packet boats are another wonderful way to experience the Erie Canal. This was Jerry at Lock 33. One of the things about when you're paddling along the canal, since the locks are state property, one can camp by any of those locks. And so I, for the most part, camped on lock property. In some cases, there would be a restroom, there were camping facilities, but then there would be towns that would be nice with restaurants and pubs and that sort of thing. But he was helping me actually get my kayak out of the water and out of the way. And again, a very helpful fellow. Of course, the DeWitt Clinton, the tug, there's a number of tugs that ply the waters. And you all know your New York, New Jersey history. The Clinton's ditch, everybody thought he was nuts. And the history, my favorite book, if you haven't read it, I commend The Wedding of the Waters by Peter Bernstein. Really talks about the long history and the buildup to the creation of the Erie Canal and its enormous success. For me, I had an additional motivation, and I'll maybe say a little more about this later. But one of the reasons I paddled the Fjords of Norway is my ancestors came from Norway in the 1800s, and they came up the Erie Canal. They came past New York, up the Hudson, on the Erie Canal. They were sloopers, they were known as, and then across the Great Lakes and settled to farm in Wisconsin and Iowa. And so what people thought was Clinton's or DeWitt Clinton's folly was actually an enormous success, not only commercially, but millions, literally millions of immigrants found their way across, including my own great-grandparents. This is the little harbor in Palmyra in what's known as the Burnt Over District. In my book, I talk about the amazing history of the Burnt Over District, but along the way, there were occasionally nice little harbors like this, and this one was particularly nice, and there was a little dock over here that was just right for a kayak. Of course, larger, higher docks here, and I set up my tent. I walked up the hill and was very happy to find the Muddy Waters Cafe. And as you can see, there's a little water. It rained that night, but the owner of the cafe said, come back for breakfast. So I didn't need much persuasion. I headed up after a rainy night in my tent to this wonderful, delicious breakfast. And my journaling, here's how I do my adventures. I journal and write as I go. And by the time I finished my adventures, I have probably, at least 50, 60, maybe 70% of my main book themes written. In that same cafe that morning, while I was eating my breakfast, were the harbor hosts, which this group over here were largely retirees who volunteer to welcome people like me when they come to Palmyra. And after their meeting, I sat with this fellow right here, Gordon, and he told me a lot of the history of the area. He was quite a history buff, and I write about that history in my book because it was a fascinating period of time. I walked into town, and I didn't really put a lot of pictures in this slideshow, but of course, architecture in these canal towns is in many cases very, very beautiful. And so I just threw this picture in just simply because I love old houses. And of course, that whole stretch along the Erie Canal has some wonderful architecture in these canal towns. Under the bridges, in a number of places, is Canal Art. And I took a picture of this one. Here's a tug and a tow and a packet boat here, and then some workers working along the canal. Just a little enjoyment along the way, and more of these bridges, more and more art is appearing. Another form of art I find when I paddle, and I'm sure many of you do too, is just what the water and the wind does to the landscape. And these were the roots of a tree that had been upended and sculpted, I thought, in a really magnificent way, and pulled me to the side for a picture. At one point, I was actually waiting to lock through, and I was kind of caught in a slurry of leaves. And at first I thought, oh, what a mess. And then I paused and I looked more carefully, and I said, no, that's an autumn collage. And there's art all around us if we have the eyes to see, or as Mary Oliver says, instructions for living, pay attention, be astonished, and then tell about it. In that first stretch in the upstate area of New York, it's largely agricultural. And of course, this is my homage to Johnny Appleseed. This was the area that he came from, and the legend began. And this was my breakfast, and just happened to be a lovely day with a lot of orchards along the canal in the early going. This was a morning. The sun was just coming up as I was leaving the little village of Weedsport. I had camped next to Devaney's Bar. It was a rainy night, and another canal angel, Cynthia, said, you know, you really don't want to be in the rain. We've got a party tent out back. Why don't you set up your tent inside that tent? And the next morning when I got up, there was a pinch pot of coffee that she had set outside my tent. And so I had my cup of coffee, and this is what I saw when I got on the water. Many, 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 many bridges, and of course, railroad bridges. And of course, the history of the canal was, the canal was in its heyday from about 1825 until the railroads came. And the canal was still important, but far less, because trains could transport more and faster. And this is one of the railroad bridges. And I took this picture, and then after I looked at it more carefully, if you'll see, there's a picture within a picture. This is Lake Oneida, and I'm camping at Verona Beach Campground, which is on the south and southeast shore. Really a lovely campground. The sun was going down. This is next to Sylvan Beach, and so I had a night in my tent, and it was a beautiful. That part of the journey was a little hair raising, as I'm sure many of you are aware. That's a very big lake, and I launched early in the morning with a slight tailwind. No big weather or big waves were forecast, and I just paddled hard and made it across the lake that day, and was very grateful because I was prepared to just paddle along the shore and maybe even get out and hitchhike if I needed to, because I wasn't going to battle big waves on that lake. But I was very fortunate to have a calm day and got across the lake. And when I got to Sylvan Beach, through a connection with the Canal Corp, who does wonderful work on the canal in the locks, but also repairing and fixing things along the way. Their canal director and I became friends, and he had told me if I could get to Sylvan Beach, I could hitchhike. And so if you're a purist, I didn't paddle the whole canal. I hitchhiked. Here's my kayak on the back of the Grand Erie. I hitchhiked for a day to Utica and enjoyed the company of these Canal Corp employees who were doing their end of the year inspection of the locks and meeting with their staff along the way over about a week-long journey. Here's the front of the Grand Erie. This was one of my favorite mornings. This is near St. Johnsville, and I launched into just a magnificent, fairly warm, foggy day, and carved my way through the fog, which, when the sun came up, melted fairly quickly. But whenever I look at this, I think of some of those magnificent Japanese paintings with kind of the landscapes. It has that feel. And I camped just in the little town on the edge of the dock in St. Johnsville. Near Spencerport, I pulled off because there was something I wanted to see. I wanted to see what the original Erie Canal looks like. There are a number of sections that have been preserved and maintained, and this is one of them. This one, I didn't include another picture, but there's actually a pull-out over here so that if barges were to come and meet each other, one could pull out and get out of the way while the other went by. The location is Skohari Crossing, and I was interested to read about it. Along the canal, in many places, the original canal, there would be, it's called Putnam's Lock Grocery. And of course, by day, it was a grocery and a very successful business. By night, it was a pub, and all sorts of things took place. And so as I talked with some of the locals and read more of the history, I found it just fascinating to see. And several places along the way, they've preserved these old buildings along the original lock. I just threw this, I snagged it off the internet, a picture of a packet boat being pulled by a couple of mules. I imagine one of them was named Sal, right? Again, one of the reasons I paddled this time, this is now towards the end of the canal, when one ends up being in the Mohawk River Valley. So the canal builders used natural waterways where they could. And so now there's a little bit of a current, not much, but the weather is getting cooler and at night, and the colors are beginning to come out. This is one of the different kinds of gates. There are movable locks, there are dams. This is called a guard gate. And this can be lowered and raised largely as a precautionary kind of thing if there's high water or if they want to lower the water to do repair work. It's a fairly simple mechanism that simply allows them to control the flow. And this is at the beginning of the section of the canal known as the Flight of Five. At the very end, if you're going toward Albany, there are 5 locks in rapid succession because the elevation loss is significant going east. And so this is at the beginning of that Flight of Five. And this is the town of Lockport, which is at the end of the Flight of Five. Beautiful little town. I pulled my kayak into this dock. There was actually a little restroom shower over here, and I headed into town and found the Rusty Pelican pub and replaced fluids at a local joint. It was a fun place to, and then I headed up next to the lock above town and set up my tent and stayed overnight. And that night I remember vividly because there was frost on my tent in the morning when I got up. This is the last lock. This is at Troy. So when one leaves the Erie Canal at Troy, one enters the Hudson River. And I spent a hotel night. When I was on the Grand Erie, I met a woman and her husband who, she was the head of the Visitors Bureau in Albany. And she said, when you get to town, you've been camping, we'll put you up in the hotel. So I had a hotel night at the Best Western, and I had my, my free food, my coffee, a nice fireplace, my journal to write in, and the tide tables, because as you all well know, now I'm going to be in tidal waters, and I want to make sure I jump on the river at the right time to get the ebb, the slack and the ebb, so I can make my way down the Hudson River. As I headed down through Albany, another river angel, a person who I had talked with before I began my journey, this is Scott Keller, who is the acting director of the Hudson Valley Greenway Water Trail. That's a mouthful. I imagine a good number of you have those maps and that guide. It was very helpful to me as I headed down the Hudson to have that kind of information as I was trying to decide how far to go each day and where to camp. And Scott, bless his heart, actually, I didn't have the maps. I had the guide, and it's kind of a thick, fat book. And he came down to the dock in Albany and had waterproof maps for me. And so he gave those to me. It was a nice way. And I'll tell you a little later when I get further down the river, I actually called him. He said, if you have any problems, call me. So as I headed, this was one of the first railroad bridges just south of Troy. Beautiful fall morning, crisp weather. Glad to be on the Hudson after 2 full weeks on the Erie Canal. And of course, just as soon as you get calm weather, what do you get? A headwind. So I was paddling down the river, staying out of the channel. You can see a sailboat here motoring down the river. Most of the boats that I encountered in the Erie Canal were these kinds of sailboats and some yachts that folks had been up in the Great Lakes during the summer sailing all over and were heading in a number of cases when I talked with them, down the canal, down the Mississippi, or down the Hudson, and we're going to head down the East Coast to the Caribbean, to warmer climes for winter sailing in warmer waters. And so I talked with quite a few of those folks. There were times when I wish I had just tied my kayak to the back of those boats, because it was blustery and fairly chilly, but at least sunny that day. The Bridge of Poughkeepsie, obviously a very famous place. Back in the day of paddling and crew races, when crew was probably the most, if not the most, maybe one of the 2 or 3 most popular sports in America, this was the finish line for where the national trials for the Olympics qualifying were held. And so this had special meaning for me. I rode crew a number of years ago. I live in Seattle, where crew is very, very big. The University of Washington has always one of the best teams in the country. And back in 1936, this is the University of Washington crew that a bunch of just great kids. I mean, families, farm families, logging families, none of them with any experience. And they came to the University of Washington, and they won the race at Poughkeepsie, went to the Olympics in Berlin in 1936 and beat Hitler's team. And that's all memorialized in a wonderful book. If you haven't read it, please check out The Boys in the Boat. There's also some documentaries that have been made on that. And I included this quote from George Yeomans Pocock, who was the builder of their shell, who I find that well, let me just read what he said. It's better than I can say it. He says, "It's great art, rowing. It's the finest art there is. It's a symphony of motion. And when you're rowing well, why, it's nearing perfection. And when you near perfection, you're touching the divine." Wow. It touches the you of yous, which is your soul. I have to admit, when I paddled under that bridge, I had tears in my eyes as I thought of these wonderful boys in the boat. The featured character in the boat right here, his daughter, I know, she lives, and he lived for many years within about 3 miles of where I live here in the Seattle area. Well, after that wonderful experience, I set up my tent on the Jersey side in Milton, just near Marlborough, which is a larger town. And there was just a little campground, and I thought, well, this is a good place to stay. Well, as you all know, there are train tracks on both sides of the Hudson. On the Jersey side, generally it's freight, and on the New York side, it's the New York Central. There are 2 train tracks there. I didn't even think about it. I was tired. I got into my tent. I went to sleep. About 4 o'clock in the morning, I hear bells ringing, bing, 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 bing. And I realized right down here, there's a crossing, and it automatic goes on because a train was coming by. And I thought, okay, well, I'll go back to sleep. It'll stop. The train actually stopped. I don't know exactly why. And it kept ringing for like an hour. Absolutely felt like I was experiencing some kind of medieval torture. And finally it stopped and the train went on. And the next morning I was in my tent, and I hear a sound, like a knocking sound. And I thought, well, that's odd. How do you knock on a tent? And I heard it again. And finally a voice said, "Hello in there, hello." And so I opened up my tent flap, and outside the tent was this young fellow and his dog. He and his dog were down for their walk in this little park in Milton, and he saw my tent, and he's a kayaker, and he said, "Do you like coffee?" And I said, "I love coffee. I'm from Seattle," right? He said, "Well, get ready, come on up. I just live just up the hill in a house, and I'm just about to fix breakfast. I'd be glad to fix you breakfast." So I had a delightful meal with this river angel and his dog. And he pushed me off later that day when the tide was right. And he handed to me an Italian pastry. He was an Italian, a paisano. And he said, "This is a cruscetta. When you get hungry later today, think of us and eat this, and it'll give you a little energy." So I actually, when I did my book tour along the Hudson, I stayed with Daniel and Chrissy, his dog, Fjord or River Angels extraordinaire. Another favorite, we're getting sort of towards the end of the journey, another favorite place near Cold Springs. I came around the bend. It was a little windy and it was cold. It was late in the day. And I came up to the Clearwater, the wonderful craft that Pete Seeger built many years ago. And you all know this history, but I love when I tell my stories to other parts of the country. The people might know Pete's music, but they don't know about his environmental efforts along the Hudson. And so I stopped in Cold Springs, camped, met some of the young people who were working on the Clearwater, and had a lovely evening in this little town across the river from West Point. And there's Pete. Where have all the flowers gone? If I had a hammer, we shall overcome. The river that flows both ways, a song many people don't know, a saint in my mind. And of course, as I get further down the river, I threw this picture in because we're now getting into the big boats, and I would imagine the ships, these are some of the craft that you all ply the waters with and see much more frequently. I saw a few large vessels up in Albany, all the way up the river, because of course the Hudson is a glacier carved tidal river that's generally quite deep. But now I was beginning to dodge larger boats. This was, I put this in there just because sometimes people who are not paddlers have an image of paddling as this romantic, beautiful, pastoral image. And this was a cold, windy day. And I was asking the question that we all ask, why am I doing this? The Bear Mountain Bridge, again, one of my favorite places from when I was a boy. This is a little video. I'll play it and I'll try here, Peter, and see if it plays, and I'll allow it to.
Yeah, it's just started giving us a frame at a time.
How did that come through, Peter? You're muted.
Thank you. It's still, it was still playing. I think it's finished now. Yeah, we get a series of stills rather than a free-flowing video. But
you got some pixelation almost, or some little segments. Well, I imagine most of you have paddled under that bridge, right?
I know. Well, a lot of us don't actually venture out on the Hudson. We stay on the smaller rivers, but it's it's we do have some who paddle the Hudson, and it's great for the rest of us to see it.
This was right next to Ossining. It was getting to be late in the day, and I was going to camp on an island, and the tide was so low that I really couldn't get through the rocks. And I followed this fellow. This is Mick. And Mick, it turns out, was the Commodore for the Chatham Yacht Club in Ossining. And I said, is there a place I can camp? He says, you know, we've just started an area in the last year where people can kayak and put their boats, and there's a beach, a sandy beach, so paddle over there. And so I did. And it was just a really nice little spot, and it's kind of a nice place to visit along the way. Let me see if I can get this next slide working here. Okay. There we go. Yeah, there's my tent, and you can see the yachts and the larger sailing vessels, but they had a nice large area for paddling craft. And I actually, when I did my book tour on Earth Day, which was part of the time of the tour, I did a program that was sponsored jointly between the Chatham Yacht Club and there's an organization that basically is a part of Pete Seeger's legacy, where they take kids out on the river to experience the river. And the Chatham Yacht Club lets them have several docks to keep their mini Clearwaters in. And so it was just fun, because here were Wall Street brokers and yachtsmen and folks with beards and tattoos. It was the most motley collection, but what had unified them all was their love of the Hudson River. Well, this was, of course, was the Tappan Zee, which now I believe is it the Mario Cuomo? Is that right? The Mario Cuomo Bridge. The redo was taking place when I went by.
I think that's what they call it.
And as I got here, the only area I would have headed over here, but because of the construction, I had to go through this small channel in the middle. And literally, I called the same fellow I was telling you about, Scott Keller, and I said, Scott, what do you suggest? And he said, oh, I know some of the people working on the bridge. I'll give you their number. So I called them, and they said, oh, we see you upriver. They're the little red boat, and you know, we'll tell you when it's safe for you to pass through, because all manner of craft were going through. And so I was very grateful for Scott and for the construction crew, who are all these guys in hard hats. So as I paddled around through this little opening, they were all cheering for me because they had been watching me come. The Palisades, you know, we're getting down the river a ways here, and I just threw in a quick shot of the Palisades. You can see the George Washington Bridge in the distance. I don't know if you've done any programs with the Yonkers Canoe Club, but I had been in touch with their Commodore, a fellow named Bill Dennison at the time, and he said, oh, you can stay here. And here he is out in front. This wonderful old building, which they're having to fight to keep there amid the high rises along the river. And I got to camp inside with all these wonderful craft on the last night in Yonkers before I headed across by the Palisades on the Jersey shore towards the Statue of Liberty. It was a wonderful place to stay overnight. And of course, the GW Bridge, as you can see, it was fairly windy. The tide was in full ebb. Because of all the different craft, the further down you get to Manhattan down here, you know, you're bouncing all over the place in the waves. But I was enjoying it. I was nearing the end of my journey, and I was flying along. I was probably going along at 6, 7, maybe even 8 knots at different times, but watching very carefully so that I wasn't running into any larger craft. And before I knew it, I was past Manhattan, and looking back, I probably would have taken more pictures, but most people have seen a lot of pictures of New York, but I was glad to make it through and make it to the end of my journey. And there's the lady. I had hoped to get much closer, but for security reasons, there are buoys. I don't see any right here, but there are buoys right about here that that say you can't get any closer. And so that's about as close as I could get to the Statue of Liberty. My friend who came to pick me up, oh, before I move to that last couple slides, I threw this picture in of the kind of bark or sailing vessel that my Norwegian ancestors would have come across in, and would have come, the statue wasn't there at the time, of course, but they would have come into New York as immigrants in 1849 on the bark Hermes. My great-grandfather, Andreas Halvorsen, landed in New York and then went up the river and the canal and across the lakes to the Midwest. So I thought of them, and they literally, I write in my books, they called out to me and they began saying, come to Norway, come to Norway. And of course, that's a whole nother story. And there I am paddling along the breakwater. My friend who I stayed with and who carried my boat back to her camp took this shot of me. And a final slide. I love Mark Twain, and of course he has this great quote, 20 years from now, you'll be disappointed more by the things that you didn't do than the ones you did. So throw out the bow line, sail away from the safe shore, catch the trade wind in your sails, explore, dream, and discover. And I'm sure many of you have that spirit in your club. But that is the end of my presentation, and I am happy to answer any questions or field any comments from the members.
Okay, well, thanks, Dave. I'm going to see if I can turn off the screen sharing so we can see more of the participants. Okay, so I'm sure people have some questions. I have a couple of questions while people are thinking of that, of theirs. And if you want to ask a question, either unmute yourself or use the chat window. But Dave, so first of all, did you plan out the trip ahead so you knew where you were going to stay each night, or did you just sort of, when you were getting towards the end of your day, just start looking for somewhere to camp?
It was always a combination of planning. I knew where I could stay, but it was always a bit of serendipity. Like when I got to that early stage and John was there and he said, do you like beer? I mean, that just felt like it was a no-brainer, right? And quite often I'd run into people and they'd say, stay. The weather affected things. So it was kind of a mix of planning and serendipity.
Okay, and then so the my other question was, as you're going along the canal, did you always take the boat into the locks to be raised or lowered, or did you ever portage around them?
I never had to portage. You can paddle through, and this is true not only of the locks in New York State, but when I paddled the Mississippi River, all I needed to do was get on my marine radio there and ask permission to lock through. And sometimes I'd be with a big, huge barge, and sometimes I'd be all by myself. So there it's the Army Corps of Engineers and our tax dollars. And so, you know, any craft can go through. And the same thing is true with the Erie Canal, which I believe the funding and the management for the Erie Canal is through the Thruway Corporation. And I think that's one of the reasons why, because of the state funding, the property is public and therefore you can camp there. But the locks were, the lock tenders were very friendly and helpful, and I could paddle through. And most of the time I was all by myself because it was late in the season.
Okay. So Betty Wiest has a question or a comment for you. Betty has led quite a few club paddles on the Hudson and out to the Statue of Liberty, or as close as we get. Betty?
Yeah, hi, Dave. Thank you so much for your presentation.
You're welcome.
I've done a lot of road trips, so I know a lot about the planning, but all these meetings with people in a serendipity kind of way, it's really truly it's kind of the best part. I'm sorry the lighting is so bad. So just so you know, I did a trip around the Statue of Liberty about a month ago, and all those white barriers are gone. We were really surprised because what I do is whenever we have a group that goes out, we have a little circle, and I kind of give some words of instruction. And I said, be mindful of the barrels. Well, what a surprise to not see them. So
wow.
that was really interesting. Yeah, what were the dates of your trip?
I did the Erie Canal and Hudson in 2016. And it was the last 2 weeks of September and the first long week of October.
Great. Beautiful time.
Yeah, it really was.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. So, Bob Rankin, I see your phone's unmuted. Do you have a question or comment?
Only a comment about the lower part of the Hudson under the pier. After the Mario Cuomo Bridge is the long Piermont Pier, where many troops left from a debarkation camp for World War II. They put them on barges and crafts to take them down to the port of New York to go to Europe. And the Jersey side of the Palisades, the river is all shoaled up there. So it's pretty shallow. So most of the heavy craft don't come in. So when I paddle there, I kind of stay close to the cliffs and close to the edge because I know that only jet skis and real small crafts will come in with their wakes. But you have to be aware that out in the shipping channel way across the river, if you see a barge, 10, 15 minutes later, all of a sudden these rolling waves come at you. But it's interesting because of the Spite and Dival at the end of Manhattan Island, all that Jersey side is pretty damn shallow all the way, a couple 100 yards out probably.
Yeah, I paddled on the Jersey shore simply because from my reading, but also my having spent some time in New York at different times, there was less traffic. There were less water taxis. There was just less commotion on the Jersey side. And so I hugged the shore pretty closely, and unfortunately didn't really run into much commotion. But there was the biggest challenge there literally was the tide and the flow and the waves. There's that effect, like you say, the barges throw up a wake, but it's the combined commotion of waves ricocheting off of different things, so the water gets pretty choppy.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
You're welcome, Bob.
Okay, it's on the hour somewhere. If it's 5 chimes, it's Dave. If it's the rest of us, it's 8. Okay. So, Kate, I see you're unmuted. Did you have a question or comment?
No.
Okay. Any anyone else have a question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I just, funny little story about canoeing on the Hudson back in my real early days when I was young and stupid instead of being old and stupid now. We had this 1924 Old Town wooden canvas canoe that leaked like a sieve. And we launched from Edgewater across down under the George Washington Bridge over to the Little Red Lighthouse and back again. No life jackets, you know, we were bailing more than we were paddling. But your reference to the wakes thrown up by the barges, it was incredible. It was like you hit one of those wakes and your bow person was 5 feet over you at times. So yeah, you have to watch out for those barges and the larger ships in that area. But we survived.
Either that or it's your ghost speaking. Okay, so
Hey, just tell Martin his water bottle or whatever is in the way of his camera. Yeah. Done.
okay.
At least my cat's rear end is not in the middle of the camera like yours.
Thanks, Martin.
Okay. Any more questions, comments?
Nice chat. Nice presentation.
Yeah,
Thank you.
and really beautiful pictures. And Dave's mentioned his book a couple of times. So the email with the invitation to join this has a link to find all of his books on Amazon. I did ask Dave if you could also get them through like your local bookstore, and he said it's easier to you could always ask at your local bookstore, but
What's it called?
better luck. So
What's the book called?
yeah, what's the book
There
title?
are 3 in the series. The general title is Paddle Pilgrim. And the first is on the Mississippi River. The second is on the Erie Canal and Hudson. And the third is on the Fjords of Norway. And then when COVID is under control, the next version or the next edition will be on the Mekong River in Southeast Asia.
Ah, whoa. Congratulations.
Okay. So last chance to ask Dave any questions.
Yeah, just on a personal basis, where north of Seattle are you located?
We live in a town, Martin, called Edmonds.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So we're right on the water. Lovely little village that goes down to the Puget Sound, and there's a ferry terminal there. And of course, you know, we really rely on ferries a lot in the Puget Sound. So it's about 20 minutes north of downtown Seattle.
Yeah. Because I was in Anacortes
Oh, sure.
a couple years ago. I spent about a week there, and then into the Mount Baker National Forest. I did that whole loop over to Leavenworth.
Right.
Yeah, so I love Seattle area. I was there like 6 times in my life already. And at one point, I wanted to move there, but I'm still in Jersey.
Well, if you love water, The Northwest is a great place, and if you love mountains, it's a great place.
Oh, yeah.
And you know, my on my website, I have, in addition to my information on my books, I produced a film on my paddling the fjords of Norway, and I talk about in that film how I'm a water spirit, and I'm happiest when I'm either on or in the water.
Mhm.
And all my life, whether it was the lakes of Minnesota where I was born, or along the Hudson in New York, or actually Southern California where I had my first teaching gig, and now the Northwest, I've always found myself near the water. And it wasn't like I planned it necessarily. It's just that that worked out, and I'm very grateful for it. So if you haven't been to the Northwest, or if you have, come back and let me know if you're going to be here. And there's great paddling in rivers and lakes, and of course the Puget Sound.
Thank you. Great presentation.
How much of your food did you take with you, or were you able to resupply like every day or so?
I always, on my adventures, make sure I have a supply of, you know, Cliff Bars and different kinds of homemade trail mix, that kind of stuff. So I have that ready. But the thing that's nice about the Erie Canal and the Hudson River is there are these towns that you can stop in and, you know, it's sampling the local cuisine, sipping the local brew. That's, for me, that's a big part of the adventure. So in this particular case, I didn't really pack a lot of food. Now in Norway, where we paddled for a month on the fjords, each of us, and we camped, each of us brought along a lot of freeze-dried and dehydrated food, and we used our jet boils to fix our food. And when we would go to town, which we would do from time to time, we would sample the local food. But there we brought most of our food with us, partially too because it's expensive in Norway. And so we tried to save a little money by bringing along freeze-dried and dehydrated food and fixing our own food as much as we could.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Did you rent a boat in Norway? Did you rent a boat?
Yes, yes. We had hoped. You saw my wilderness experience expedition boat that I paddled along the river. I had hoped my good boat, or my happy boat here, is a Current Designs Solstice, and it's a composite boat. And I know the people that make Current Designs. It's also the people that make Winona boats in Winona, Minnesota. And their sales rep had us all set up to have Current Design boats in Norway.
Ooh.
And then the trade embargo hit.
Oh.
And so we had to rent, but it worked out fine. I mean, they were not great. They were rotomolded plastic. I call them, when motor rolled boats, I call them beater boats because you don't bother, you know, dragging them on rocks. And so we rented from an outfit in Norway for a month. The boats, PFDs, paddles, jackets, wetsuits, pretty much everything we needed. Each of us got for a month for about $800.
Oh, all right. That's good.
Yeah, I thought it was terrific. And so we got by, although the first day on the fjords of Norway, I was paddling in big water and my rudder broke.
Not good.
So we had to do some repair work. And from then on out, other than weather issues, we had a wonderful time in Norway.
Great. Super.
Were you worried at all on your trip on the Erie Canal about security, leaving your boat, leaving your tent, you know, when you went here and there? Did you lock it up? What did you do?
No, I actually didn't, Naomi. You know, I may be a fool, or maybe I'm just an optimist or trusting, but for the most part, on the Mississippi and Norway, wherever I've been, I have a lock, and occasionally I'll chain it up. Although if anybody wanted to get it, they could just cut it. But generally, I've been pleased and fortunate to not have any problems along the Erie Canal. You know, you're in these little towns, and there's a little dock or a little landing place, and so I, for the most part, would just tie up, and I didn't have any problems. Now, maybe I'd be a little more cautious tying up. I don't want to say anything negative about New Jersey, but in New York, if I were to, maybe I'd be a little more cautious tying up to some dock down in Manhattan, right?
Dave, you carried VHF radio and used that to contact the lock keepers and
Say that
so
again.
Did you have a VHF radio that you could contact the lock keepers with along the canal?
Yeah,
Or
I
do you
always
just-
have a marine radio with me, and I use it for not only communicating with locks, but also weather forecasts through the National Weather Service. So I always have that and set it up in my tent at night and listen to the weather forecast and decide how it's going to go the next day. Yeah.
Did you have very many rainy days on the Erie Canal?
I really didn't. I'm trying to think. There was at least probably 2, but they were not heavy rain. They were more, remember that day in St. Johnsville where it was misty?
Yeah.
So it was misty and moist and actually kind of, I thought, beautiful. The bigger issue was wind, and I remember paddling at least 3 days into headwinds that were pretty stiff. And so how you paddle close to shore and you try to stay out of the wind. I'm trying to remember what town it was. Left this one town, was paddling close to shore because of strong winds. I mean, they were 15, 20 mile an hour winds. So I was just creeping along the shore. And those are the days when you wonder, should I just go back to town?
Pack it in.
But that day, the other thing that was crazy was all of a sudden I'm paddling along the shore and a fish comes flying across the bow of my boat.
Woo!
Have any of you encountered the Asian carp, the flying carp?
Yes.
Well, they are in the Erie Canal, and they are in the Hudson River. I didn't see any there. And a lot of them are in the Mississippi River. And so I had one that it flew across right in front of my face, close enough that my sunglasses had spray on them from the water. And it was, the fish gets bigger with each telling. I would imagine it was at least 2 feet long. It was a big fish. So that's a real issue. And invasive species in our waterways, I think, is something that, one of the courses I taught at the college for a number of years was environmental ethics and environmental science. And in our waterways, thank God for people like Pete Seeger and what he has done and others have done in the Hudson and other waterways. But we are in a time right now when a lot of those regulations are being challenged, or even, I don't want to get into politics here too much, but most paddlers I know are pretty serious environmentalists, and we are not in a time of particularly friendly environmental politics. So I will get off my soapbox.
Well, we've moved our next month's meeting. We usually meet on the first Tuesday of the month, but we're not going to meet on Election Day. So if people haven't voted already, you don't have the excuse that, it's getting late and I have to go to the Canoe Club meeting. I can't vote. We're not meeting on the 3rd. We're meeting on the Okay, so anyway, any more questions?
I have a quick question, if I may.
Go ahead.
If for those who haven't been on the Erie Canal, is there any current at all? And also, how many hours a day did you typically paddle? And what wildlife did you see along the way?
Okay. The only place really, Mark, where there is current is when you get into the Mohawk River Valley. You know, Schenectady, Amsterdam, in the far eastern part of the canal. And it's not a lot of current. And so I really don't think that, I mean, like I say, the bigger issue is wind, because the canal is fairly large and the river gets even larger. And if you've got a headwind, you're dealing with that issue. Wildlife, I'm trying to think, Asian carp. There were lots of heron. I saw a few eagles, not very many, not like we see out here in the Northwest. In some of the areas where there were these trees down, there were a lot of turtles. You know, actually I saw some otter in a few places as well. And they're always fun to play hide and seek with. They're curious, and very often you think they're leaving, but they're actually going to hide and watch. And then I play hide and seek with creatures. And for me, that's one of the highlights whenever I'm on the water is the wildlife, and just enjoying all the animals along the way. So yeah, there was quite a bit of wildlife along the canal and along the river, although on the river I was having to pay a little more attention to the water and the tide and the currents and the boats. So I was probably not quite as alert to the wildlife. Was there another question in there, Mark? Was there?
Just how many hours a day did you typically paddle?
It varied, and it was actually because the season was getting later and the days were shorter, and actually the locks are open shorter days as the fall comes on. So I had to, I'm trying to remember, the locks close in the late season, and the Erie Canal will be closing here probably in the next, I think, week. I think the locks closed, if I'm remembering correctly, at 5 o'clock in the late season. So that was always kind of a benchmark. And so what I would try to do is get on the water early, because oftentimes there was less wind. And quite often, like you saw in a couple of those pictures, particularly there by Weedsport, the sun was just coming up. But of course, the sun is only up this time of year a lot less. So my longest paddling day would be 8 hours, maybe 9 hours. And that was about all I could paddle in terms of daylight. But there were some days when it would be 5 or 6. But to get 363 miles, to get 500 miles in 3 weeks, you kind of do the math, and you can see I had to be on the water a good bit. And my only, not regret, but the only thing I would change in a future adventure, if I were to do that same adventure, I would take a month. I would take 4 weeks and spend a little more time in the villages and towns along the canal and along the Hudson.
Nice.
Yeah, and Dave, I think you said that the canal stretch was 350 miles. Is that right?
363, actually.
63. And you did that in 2 weeks?
Yeah.
Yeah, so too late in the evening for my brain to do the math, but you could do the math.
Yeah, I know, mine too.
It sounds like you paddled a good distance for a good number of hours each day.
Yes, yes.
Okay, other questions?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Dave, so when you paddle there between Schenectady and Amsterdam on the mighty Mohawk there,
Yep.
But
Yep.
it wasn't always so. My grandfather grew up in Schenectady, and he told stories about he would swim in the Erie Canal in Schenectady, and now in Schenectady there's no longer an Erie Canal, but there's Erie Avenue,
Oh.
and that's where the canal was, and then it
Oh.
filled in. So that's just a tad east of your route there through Schenectady.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that stretch of the river is really interesting. You know, you've got some significant, I wouldn't call them cliffs, but bluffs along the river. Very, very beautiful, and the geology of that stretch of the river I really enjoyed. And you know, it's interesting you mentioned Schenectady, or when you mention those areas, or the old canal in Syracuse, for example. The canal used to come right literally through Syracuse, and the Erie Canal Museum in Syracuse, you know, is the canal has been filled in. It's a street now. So quite often, I mean, there's not a lot of the canal, the original canal, left. But that book I mentioned, The Wedding of the Waters by Peter Bernstein, is a remarkable tale about that period of time when not only DeWitt Clinton, but Jefferson and some of the early colonists wanted to build a canal up the Chesapeake, right? And the problem with all these canals ultimately was they ran into mountains. You know, and DeWitt Clinton and others well before him, he's kind of the most famous person, you know, looked at all the different kinds of routes. And even, I mean, it took 7 or 8 years to do the Erie Canal. And the terrain on that canal, and there are 35 locks now, but there were over 100 locks in the original Erie Canal. And in some places, as you probably all know, the canal is actually elevated and it becomes an aqueduct and went over other bodies of water. So it was a political tour de force. It was an engineering, I mean, it was, I think, one of the wonders of the world of the time. And I really loved reading that book and learned an enormous amount. It's history, but it reads like a great historical novel almost. So I commend that book to you. I think you'd all enjoy it.
So now you've got 4 books to put in your Amazon cart. Dave's 3 plus Wedding of the Waters.
And by the way, there are several websites. In fact, I helped to create the New York Canalways website. And now it has over 1,000, not website, Facebook group. So if you look for Facebook groups, the New York Canalways is one. There's now a new one called Canalways Challenge, and people are actually challenging each other to bicycle, paddle, walk the canalways, and there's now swag, paraphernalia, shirts and hats that you can get, and so it's been really fun to see these different resources. And the New York Historical Corridor, which manages much of this. If you just Google, my book also has all these websites, but there are Facebook pages. So another thing that you could do, let's say you decide you want to paddle the Erie Canal some year, right? And you're going to go from Albany the other direction. You would go literally to this Facebook group that has over 1,000 people, many of whom who've canaled or paddled parts of the canal, who live along the canal. And you'd say, okay, I'd like to paddle. And you'd have people say, okay, when you come by my house in Tonawanda, call me, here's my number, you can stay with me. I mean, this is kind of what's happened on the Mississippi River. It's happened on the Missouri River. It's happened on the Erie Canal. There are a number of wonderful Facebook groups that allow you to connect with people along the rivers and the canals, and they will, they will help you out. Those are those canal angels. They are available to help you out. So I commend you Google and look for these various Facebook groups, and you can join, and you'll see people posting pictures of their journeys down the Erie Canal and the Hudson River.
If you're interested in the geology, there's a British author, Simon Winchester, who talks about the start of geology in England when they realized when they're digging these canals that all over England in these different places you would find different layers of materials that were similar in far different areas. And then they started in the notion of tectonics and whatnot.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And the English canals really were the model that the Erie Canal was based on. If you go to England, there are canals, and have been for much longer than in the US. And these canals, you can actually paddle today. They've become kind of tourism destinations, and many of them were used to haul coal further up north in England. And so the models that they had to build the Erie Canal, they looked to England for some of the examples.
Yeah, and I was just having a quick look. The website for information about paddling and cycling the Erie Canal is eriecanalway.org.
Yep.
So all one word, eriecanalway.org. And I believe there may also be a printed guidebook now to paddling the Erie Canal.
There's a really, really excellent printed guidebook, and it has information on restaurants and hotels and bars and hotel accommodations along the way, camping locations. So this is the upstate New York. Many areas there are very depressed economically. One of the things I learned, I've done a lot of work in poorer communities over my career, and a number of the folks in upstate New York described several of the communities very much as being like Appalachia in terms of the poverty. Many of those communities had thriving businesses along the canal, but a number of them, those businesses have gone away, whether it's in Rochester or Syracuse or various places. And one of the things that I've worked with the Canal Corp and others on, and your governor has been, and the state legislature has been very generous to provide grants that essentially provide support for those local communities as along the canal for tourism, because it really is a beautiful area. It's a historic area, and the canal, whether paddling or cruising or biking or walking, I mean, it really is a treasure. And I think it's only in some ways being discovered for that. And I'm really happy to see that. And I'm glad that my little effort and kind of encouragement is, I hope, helping a little bit to help those areas.
Okay. So hopefully, I'm not sure how many of us are going to take on a 3-week or 4-week end-to-end paddle, but it's maybe we can approach it like the proverbial eating the elephant and do it one bite at a time, one lock pound at a time. Anyway, so thanks, Dave, very much. I think everyone really enjoyed your presentation, the great pictures, and stories about your travels and so on. I see Andy has figured out how to make a clapping. I guess there's a reaction button at the bottom, so you can click the clap, or you can.
Thank you.
So anyway, thanks, Dave. What I'm going to do is I'm going to consider this the end of Dave's presentation. I'm going to turn off the recording, but we can stay on the line, and if people have any questions or comments about club paddles or other club business, so Dave, you're welcome to stay, or we'll let you go.
Okay, I will leave and head to dinner, but thank you again, one and all. And I hope our paddles cross one of these days. Take care.
Okay, well,
Thanks again.
okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.